There's one problem with that. You can't get to where you want to be unless you legislate. It doesn't happen automatically. And in order to legislate, you need two things. You need collaboration between the two sides, and you need public trust. Yeah. Without public trust, there can't be governance. And without governance, there is chaos. And what does lack of governance produce? Anger.
Welcome back to the Vetted Conversations podcast,
where we delve into the foundations, workings, and current challenges to the American way of self-governance.
In today's confusing world, it's more important than ever to understand how our government works and how we, as citizens, can actively participate in the discussion to safeguard our liberties and continued freedom.
Our mission is to ensure you, our listeners, have the knowledge and insights needed to become more informed and engaged citizens and active members of your communities. So let's get into it.
Hello, everybody. Part of our mission here is to help increase our collective understanding of civics, namely our rights, and perhaps more importantly, our responsibilities to each other as citizens in a free society. Based on your feedback from Season 1, we are adding a short civics discussion to each episode in Season 2 to help better explain how our government is organized and how it is designed to work so that we can all more effectively engage with our elected and appointed officials and help create a more perfect union. Joining us today is Dr. Shawn Healy, a civics expert and the Senior Director for Policy and Advocacy at iCivics. iCivics is our nation's leading nonprofit civic education organization whose mission is to ensure the practice of democracy is learned by each new generation. Shawn, it's so good to have you back to educate us today. Here's our question for today's episode. Why did the founders intentionally make laws hard to pass and the business of Congress intentionally slow?
So I think it goes back to, once again, concerns about the excesses of democracy and that the process of lawmaking should be deliberate. I will say that the framers, I think it's fair to say, they didn't account for the rise of national parties. They were grappling with that as the first Congress was constituted. But didn't political parties in their modern form didn't exist, and certainly didn't account for the extent to which we're so polarized ideologically, and that of course has a geographic component to it too. We've been polarized at other points in our history, but those two phenomena make it even more difficult to achieve compromise and to pass legislation. They also, of course, didn't create the filibuster. So the filibuster is a modern or a more modern than the framers suggested. So it emerged in the 1800s. The Senate adopted this, and it's another obstacle to legislative productivity. And then specifically around amending the Constitution, they made that very difficult, of course, too. We've only done it 27 times. 10 of those amendments were adopted basically at the outset. So Constitution is drafted in 1787. By 1791, we have the first 10 amendments we call the Bill of Rights. It's only 17 cents. Actually, the last amendment we adopted, the 27th, was part of the original proposed Bill of Rights and was basically one that was kind of many states had considered, but not enough to formally ratify. So that's kind of an aberration. We've had no new amendments other than that relic since 1971, when 18-year-olds got the right to vote. So made that process really difficult, right? So 2/3 of both bodies have to ratify an amendment, and then ultimately has to go to states, 3/4 of states. So that's 38 states would have to vote to ratify. So made that process very arduous. And in this current context, with relatively strong national parties, and then us being ideologically polarized, particularly in relationship to those parties, and once again tied to the geography of the country, makes it very difficult, one, almost impossible to adopt a constitutional amendment, but even difficult to pass a budget, right, in the current Congress.
Yeah. And I've seen this tension that you talk about between parties and polarization all the way back to like watching the musical Hamilton, where you've got Hamilton, who wants a strong federal government and a centralized form, and Jefferson, who wants a federalized system where the states hold most of the power. And it seemed like there was a big tension between kind of like the cities as economic units, and then Jefferson, who wanted us to be a land of farmers, right? So you
Yeah,
had this
agrarian
rural
republic.
urban kind of divide back then
Yeah,
too. But I think your point about what's the right balance, because if we have if it's too hard to pass laws, because the right incentives aren't in place, then the business of government doesn't get done. If it's too easy to pass laws, then we really kind of become subject to the whims of mob rule. So,
right.
what's the right balance, and how do we find it?
Yeah, I think it's a perpetual debate, right? And it is. You mentioned some of the issues that our founders debated about. I think we're having many of those same debates in the modern context. What's the right role for the national government versus states in localities, right? What are the interests of big cities versus suburbs now, and which wasn't really probably a thing at the time of our founding, and rural areas. We've of course seen this tremendous shift in population and continued growth of metropolitan areas and declining population in rural areas. And I think many of our contemporary debates are tied to that. I don't know there's a right answer per se. I do feel like as we talk about Congress, it could certainly function better. Congress hasn't passed a budget through regular order in a few decades.
Yeah.
And as we're recording this, Congress, 6 months into a fiscal year, just adopted its budget for the balance of the year. So I would suggest that that's quite dysfunctional, right? But part of it is a product of such, in aggregate, a very evenly divided electorate, right? Where Republicans have this very narrow majority in the House, and the Democrats, of course, control the Senate. So it's divided government, and these parties that are behaving more like European parties. So they're behaving more like parliamentary government. Of course, we don't have a parliamentary system. We have a presidential system. So there are things we could probably do to make Congress more functional. And I think that's an important debate to have, because I would suggest it's been pretty dysfunctional for the past few decades.
Awesome. Yeah, and I think a lot of that's like, how do we systemically put the right incentives in place that promotes things like consensus and compromise, and working towards the efficient passage of legislation, I guess. But yeah, no, thank you so much for your thoughtful answer on that. Among our three branches of government, the U.S. Congress has been increasingly acrimonious and even dysfunctional lately. With exceedingly low public opinion poll numbers, many believe that Congress can and should work better. Joining us today to discuss this is Mike Johnson, the co-author of Fixing Congress, Restoring Power to the People. Mike, welcome.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Could you tell us a little bit, before we get into the subject of the book, how did you come to this work? You've had a long and distinguished career in politics. Could you just kind of tell us a little bit about your background?
Yeah, well, I came to Washington back in the late 1970s. Had been an editor of a newspaper in Illinois, and went to work in the Ford White House. And from there went to Congress as first press secretary and then chief of staff to House Republican leader Bob Michel,
Okay.
Who he retired from Congress in 1994. So I'm kind of the ghost of Congress past. Most people don't remember Bob, but at any rate, I was involved in and still am really to a certain degree, in the organization called the Congressional Institute, which conducted forums and conferences for members of Congress and staff. And our whole mission was to help members of Congress and staff do their jobs better and to educate their constituents. In that process, Jerry Clymer and I co-wrote a book called Surviving Congress, which was intended as a primary guide for members of Congress and staff. Nice. And it's now in its 6th edition, I believe. There are something like 200,000 copies in circulation or something. Maybe that was just 20,000. I can't. But at any rate, I was when I was still working, I was in a cab on my way back to my office, and I love to talk to cab drivers, and I had talked about surviving Congress and what we did at the Institute, and he said, excuse the language, but why in the hell don't you write something like that for us? So we know what's going on up there. and I talked to Jerry about that, and we had a number of conversations about it, and so we set about writing the book, and here we are. Well, I get that question a lot, and the answer is, when people ask you that question, they expect you to have a specific view of who your audience is and where they live and how much they make, and we don't. The fact is that our book is intended for people who are frustrated with dysfunctional government and um, and angry with their politicians and want to do something about it. They're tired of being shut out, and so that's our audience. And you really can't define it. It's young people, particularly, who are not being educated in civics in our schools today, and older Americans who just want something done here.
What are some of the top misconceptions people have about Congress? You busted a
Oh
couple
boy,
myths in the book.
they have a lot of them. We have been watching internet social media traffic for a very long time, and you
Yeah.
run across all of these some idiotic perceptions of Congress and members of Congress, that they so many percent have been in jail, and members can't go to jail. They don't have to pay Social Security. They get extraordinary health care benefits. They get free housing. They just all kinds of stuff like that. And we mentioned some of those in the book, and they're all wrong.
Yeah.
They're just simply not true. Others are so badly exaggerated they really border on falsehood. So
Yeah.
it's pretty pervasive, and it's not healthy for the Congress.
Absolutely, or the Republic. I'd add.
Yes.
There's a lot of misinformation out on the internet, especially in social media. So media literacy, like understanding like where to go for good information is a very important thing, and
Yep.
going where to go for good information about our three branches of government, I think is especially important, especially now at this point in our history. But speaking of history, maybe we ought to go back to the start. Like, what was the founders' vision for Congress?
Excuse me. Yeah, uh, they were brilliant men, many of them, and unfortunately they were men, but men ran things back then,
Yeah,
missing out on a great resource. But they understood most of them were very avid readers and students of history, particularly European history, and how governments were created and what caused them to fail. Several of them were involved in the creation of the governments of the colonies at the time, and so they were able to apply that knowledge and what they saw wrong and what they saw right. And when they closed the windows and shut the doors in Philadelphia and wrote the Constitution, they kept that in mind. More importantly, they understood that the country was going to grow. They could see out west and envision larger populations and more states and everything. So they constructed a constitution that was very flexible and pliable
Mm.
and could be changed to accommodate modern times and interpreted to keep up with modern times. So they created a constitution that could be amended, and there have been 27 amendments um, uh, to the Constitution. But to show you what a marvelous document it is, there have been 11,000 amendments proposed to the Constitution and only
Wow.
27 adopted. So
Wow.
it has proved to be a document for the ages and a structure of law for the country for the ages.
But when you think about like when our country was founded, um, the founders had a very specific vision for how they wanted to govern themselves and what they didn't want. And I see in the Declaration, also in the Constitution, a rejection of essentially strongman rule, which was we call them kings, but that was pretty much the ever since we stopped living as hunter gatherers
Yeah.
and established civilization. I mean, that's pretty much the way things were run. So I think maybe um, not enough Americans understand like how this truly was an experiment democracy. And I was wondering if you could kind of talk about that a little bit.
It really is an experiment, and it continues to be an experiment, but it is also the longest functional constitution among all of the democratic nations. And the republic, which we created as an experiment, it's a representative democracy, but it is a republic, and its structure is something that has endured over a very long time. The founders were smart enough and angry enough at the British to understand that the people really had to have a say in their governance, which the colonies were denied so much. So that was kind of the core of their thinking. Let's be free people. Let's let people do what they want, but also give them a governmental umbrella that can make their lives secure and ensure their freedom and their pursuit of happiness,
Yeah.
and get away from this conglomeration of individual states that had caused so much confusion in the areas of trade and finance and taxes. And so they wanted a stronger federal well, qualify that. Some of them wanted a strong federal government, and fortunately they prevailed. Patrick Henry and George Mason and others had some real doubts, particularly Patrick Henry, who didn't even want to participate in the process. And so he was responsible, by the way, for gerrymandering, but that's another story. So they had the right formula, and they had the right attitude. Unfortunately, of course, when they were talking about the people ruling, they were only talking about certain people. Yeah,
Right.
but we have that again is the brilliance of our system. We have evolved over time, and accepted and encouraged a lot of diversity and more people being involved in the governmental process. Unfortunately, and this is the core of the book, civics education, so many Americans today don't have the knowledge and the information and the access to engage in self rule. Like you said, about the three branches, only 40% of the American people, according to Annenberg, can name the three branches of government, and 17% can't name one.
Wow.
So that's an example of where our educational system has come from. Almost 50% of the American people couldn't pass the citizenship test today,
Yeah.
according to the surveys.
You do a great job in your book of talking about like the design character of the two different houses, right, within the Congress. So the House of Representatives kind of be more the voice of the people, and then the Senate being a much more deliberative body. Can you go into that a little bit more and kind of tease that out for us and make us a little bit smarter about the original intent of the Senate and the House?
Yeah. Well, there was the a lot of the founders believed strongly in preserving the voice of the states in in the conduct of government, and there was also this fight in the Constitutional convention about how you balance out large states with large populations and smaller states. How do you give them equal representation in this kind of system? Because the people of Virginia felt like they should have more control because there was more of them.
Mhm.
And so the smaller states said, look, you're going to freeze us out of the process. It's kind of like they're trying to do today with big cities versus rural areas.
Right.
So they ended up with a great compromise with the Senate giving the smaller states equal representation. Every state gets 2 senators, and the House then would be decided, the size of the House would be decided by the population of the state. So this kind of equalized what they were doing. And it's interesting. Founders considered the House and Senate equal branches uh, of the Congress, but it came to be, and the media has always had something to do with this Senate, because members are there for 6 years, are seem to elevated to this grandeur that House Representatives members don't enjoy.
Yeah.
And they call the Senate the upper body and the House the lower body. The only
Right.
reason for that is that in Federal Hall, when they first met as a Congress, the Senate was on the second floor and the House was on the first floor. And but that has created a mystique about the two bodies that was never really intended. And early on, the founders also created a system whereby senators would be appointed by the state legislatures,
Right. Remember
not
that.
elected. And
Yeah.
that was to give the states more of an exposure and more authority in the influence of federal decisions.
Your book's all about fixing Congress. We know that Congress has got very, very low public opinion ratings. And it seems like people may be more happy with their elected officials than they are with Congress as a whole. Um, but I think 8% was the last public opinion rating that I saw.
Yeah,
Military's,
favorable rating.
yeah, by contrast, like the military and veteran community is usually around 78 or 74,
Right,
78%. Small business also ranks pretty high.
right.
And the medical profession also ranks pretty high typically. But when we think about like fixing Congress, could you tell us, like, from your perspective, what's wrong?
Well, regrettably, there's an awful lot wrong. The committee structure is no longer dependent upon to create laws and send them to the floor for the full Congress consideration. That's a mess. Jurisdictions are screwed up. The changes that have come about in the last 50 years in this country have just simply overpowered Congress and made it very, very difficult to pass laws. So that's why you get all of these appropriation bills that are lumped into one. The 12 appropriation bills haven't been adopted singularly since 1997, I believe,
Oof. Wow.
when my good friend Bob Livingston was chairman of the Appropriations Committee. He he was the last to really, really get that done. And but beyond that, civility has just been ripped apart and torn to shreds in our public dialogue, but more importantly among politicians. No better example than the kind of language that Trump uses today. Too many members of Congress are at each other's throats, don't trust each other, and are unwilling to work together. The Republicans in the House, in my time, sometimes had a difficult time dealing with Democrats, but they did, and Democrats were reluctant to work with Republicans, but they did. And now you have a situation where Republicans and Democrats, a good many of them, will absolutely refuse to work with the opposite party in getting something done. That's one of the reasons why McCarthy is not speaker anymore.
Yeah.
Now it's even gone further. Now we have a situation where Republicans refuse to talk to Republicans, and some Democrats refuse to talk to Democrats. How can you possibly govern in that kind of environment where people are such children that they refuse to talk to their siblings?
Yeah.
It is just unconscionable. And beyond that, there is a rigidity in the various caucuses within the caucuses in the House and Senate, and in Democrats and Republicans. So you have these extremisms that commit members of Congress to positions that can't possibly become law.
Yeah.
And they know that. There is a division now between those who come to Congress to govern and to legislate, and those who come to Congress to preach and alienate. So that has created an environment as well that's just impossible to deal with. One very important thing has changed, that politics, the conduct of politics, it's basically a decision-making process, was conducted on a professional level, on a business-like level. Today, it is conducted on a personal level. And when people don't like each other, the politics gets personal. And engaging in those kinds of personalities and that kind of behavior just simply does not work. One other point. When you look at the extremes on both sides, you think, well, they're standing up for what they believe in and what they think the country ought to be. There's one problem with that. You can't get to where you want to be unless you legislate. It doesn't happen automatically. And in order to legislate, you need two things. You need collaboration between the two sides, and you need public trust. Without public trust, there can't be governance. And without governance, there is chaos. And what does lack of governance produce? Anger.
What do you think might be incentivizing this bad behavior?
Yep. It's all of the above.
Yeah.
You can trace it back to Bob's time, the 1970s and 1980s. There was the Tea Party movement, which the press and everybody just dismissed as a bunch of wackos. Turned out to be a very valid, structured movement that demonstrated the frustration of so many people that were right of center that didn't feel like the government was going in the right direction. And so around the time that Newt Gingrich was running for office for Congress from Georgia, he lost 3 times actually before he won. That frustration was growing. And House Speaker Jim Wright was responsible for a lot of that too. He was a dictatorial type of speaker who didn't want to cooperate with the Republican side, and that really frustrated people so much more that when Newt came along, he knew exactly how to capitalize on those feelings.
Right.
And he brought members to a boiling point where they decided that something more drastic had to be done to take the majority away from the Democrats. And so they developed harsher political strategies, and they intensified and dramatized the language and how Republicans presented themselves. So that was really the start of the movement. It was corrosiveness on both sides of the aisle, but someone, and Newt Gingrich was and remains really brilliant in a lot of ways, and he knew what was needed, and he had the communicative ability to make it happen. So over a period of almost 2 decades, he worked it very hard. And it frustrated the legislative process because Michael and O'Neill and Reagan and Howard Baker in the Senate, they were all trying to get legislation passed.
Right.
Newt was trying to dis, you know, destruct the system to make a point. So now Newt is kind of a daisy compared to what they're doing now. What the real right wing and the left wing are doing to foment dissidents, and along the way they forgot what the hell they were there for.
Yeah.
It's become a situation where the strategy and the goal is to upset the system, and they offer nothing in return.
When you think about Congress, what needs to change in order to do exactly what your book says of restoring power to the people?
Well, there are the book is really about 4 core changes that need to be made, or reforms have to be brought to fruition. One is the civics we talked about. 2 is congressional reform, which we talked about. The budget process and the appropriations process just can't function under the system that we have now.
Yeah.
The 3rd is outside influences. It's not just the press, it's lobbying, it's the political parties, it's not-for-profit institutions that were created and designed to influence Congress and promote a specific ideology. And finally, it's the campaign process, the partisan process of campaigns, the amount of money being spent in campaigns. All of those outside influences take away from the access and influence of the citizens.
Yeah.
And what we have got to do is correlate around empowering citizens to be able to exercise their beliefs and get through to Congress a lot better without all of this other smoke and noise around. And finally, the 4th pillar is civility.
Yeah.
We cannot move forward in Congress unless these folks communicate with each other and realize that, as Alexander Hamilton said in the Federalist Papers, that different points of view can be different and still have merit.
Sure.
And the open mind of members of Congress can bring different points of view together and create public policy and law.
Yeah.
But you first have to recognize that your opponent has valid views and that your opponent is well motivated. And it doesn't take too long for a politician to figure out whether someone is rightly motivated or not. I mean, that's part of the job. So those 4 things are really absolutely critical in fixing Congress, and it's a big job. But if you empower citizens and change your whole mindset toward what the Congress is supposed to do and how to do it, then you can start achieving these goals. Citizens have to start putting pressure on the media and on their representatives to take a different approach and outlook, and just end the anger and the hatred and the rigidity.
Let me give you one last question before we wrap up, because I want to be respectful of your time here. If you had a magic wand and you could change anything today relative to Congress, what's the most important thing that would have the biggest impact? What would you do?
Civility.
Yeah.
Um, I can't think of anything more fundamental and something that reaches the very core of who we are and what the founders intended this system to be than the ability. We have the capability, we just don't have the ability to come together and reach the center. The center of our political system is where the decisions are made and where the laws are made. They are not made on the extremes. And like we said earlier, you simply can't get anything done, regardless of you want a big government, you want a little government, you want an oppressive government, you want a limited government. You have to legislate to get there. And you can't legislate without talking. And you can't legislate without trust and collaboration. So I think that's at the core. And maybe number two would be civics, educating and activating and engaging the citizenry.
Absolutely. No, and that's certainly something we're trying to do here, and remind people that you can disagree without being disagreeable.
Exactly.
And that no matter what you're being told, the American on the other side of the political issue from you, who you vehemently disagree with, is not the enemy. Our nation's enemies exist outside our borders, and that is still your fellow American. And I think, thinking through how we even talk about other people. Are we talking about them in language that humanizes them, or dehumanizing them, which leads to really bad outcomes, as we've seen throughout history. So I think, just making a call to remind, our fellow Americans, you're your fellow American, treat them with respect, because you never persuade other people from the vantage of your own values. You got to figure out what they care about and hook into that and find the common ground. Right. So, Mike, this is been a great conversation. I've really enjoyed it. Your book is well written, covers a lot of congressional history, very digestible. I think I've read through it in 3 days. It got a lot out of it. A lot of interesting facts about Congress. So I really hope you sell a bajillion copies of this thing. I think your aim is noble in educating people about here's what the intent of Congress is. This is how it's evolved over time. And this is what you, American citizen, needs to do to make it more responsive to you, right? And ultimately return the power. The ultimate check on power in this country is the people, right? So I think.
Thank you very much for that, Joe. I really appreciate it. And Fixing Congress goes on sale today, so just keep your fingers crossed.
Awesome. Well, I wish you and Jerome Clymer, your co-author, the very best.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Joe. It's very good to be with you. And good luck.
As part of Season 2, we want to provide veterans a way of getting more involved in their communities to advocate for the issues that they care about. To do this, we're featuring veteran organizations that we think you might be interested in. Today's spotlight is on Hill Vets, and representing them today is Justin Brown. Justin's a U.S. Navy veteran and founder of Hill Vets, which is a nonprofit organization that empowers veterans to serve their country again, this time in government. And Justin's also served as a subcommittee staff director in the U.S. House of Representatives. He ran for office himself in the Virginia's 44th District, and also served as a congressional liaison officer for the Department of Veterans Affairs. He also leads his own government affairs shop called the Nimitz Group. So Justin, welcome. And where are you in the country, and how are you doing today?
Hey, thanks, Joe. It's great to be with you. Good to be with an old friend. And I am an 8-minute walk from the United States Capitol right now in my office, just right here, haunting the shadow of the Capitol, I suppose.
Awesome. Well, could you share for our audience, what is Hill Vets and what's the mission?
Yeah, so the way I see the Hill Vets Foundation is we're really the community for veterans, service members, spouses, and survivors in and around Capitol Hill, Washington, D.C., and kind of the policy space that, this city is obviously so focused on.
Awesome. And how do you help veterans? So say I'm transitioning off of active duty, or maybe I'm a surviving spouse and I want to make a difference in Washington. How do you help?
I would say we've kind of focused on these three components, maybe, well, three, I'd say. So, kind
Okay.
of this idea of networking and community.
Yeah.
And then Hill Vets House being an opportunity for the men and women we serve outside of this community to get into this community if they'd
Right.
like to. And then I think the third component ended up being our second program, which was Hill Vets Lead, which
Okay.
is focused on leadership. And really what that was focused on was men and women who'd already made their way to Washington, D.C., and maybe, and in most cases, were already fairly successful, not fairly, just maybe, mid-level career success, and helping them, build an awesome cohort of peers. But then also with that peer group that they're building incredible relationships with, to their left and right, provide them with, an awesome group of alumni who maybe are ahead of them.
Yeah.
And obviously if you were in class one, you didn't have an alumni, you were the pioneers, if you will, but we're now on our ninth cohort.
Right.
So, there's a rich, alumni group there, but then also layering in some very senior leadership for, our leadership participants to learn from and to start thinking and articulating about what's next. I believe in our military veteran community incredibly. I think we're some of, I think we have, both an incredible skill set. I think we have a rare identity that puts, our nation before party politics for the most part. And I would encourage that. Be a former service member or current service member or veteran or spouse or survivor before you're a Democrat or a Republican, in my opinion. I think that's healthy. And our country needs that now more than ever.
Yeah.
And with all of that, there, what we've really tried to build here is, how do we help, men and women think about, continued service to their nation and, to their cohort. And then we're a limited number now. It's not like post World War II where, we were, whatever it is, 40-50% of, the male population, over the course of 15 years or something.
Right.
We're a much smaller population. So I think we have to think smartly about what it means to, have both the gift of military service. I think, I hear people, insinuate I'm a victim, and I don't think so. I feel very lucky, fortunate. As a child, I dreamt of military service, and I was able to do that. And was it easy? No. Was my service the hardest? That I've seen? Not even close. So you can gauge those statements however you want, but at the end of the day, I do believe in continued service, and I've tried to, with the help of so many others and so many supporters, try to build something that, our fellow service members can be proud of, as well as, I hope our fellow citizens as well.
For sure. And what I love about your approach is not only are you helping network, right? Because veterans will help each other out if they know who the other veterans are, which is a little bit harder once you're in civilian clothes than in uniform, of course. But beyond that, by having multiple cohorts, you're providing a pathfinding function of sorts, where if I am completely new to Washington, I want to serve, but I don't know how, or I don't really know how this thing works. I could come to Hill Vets and get connected with people who've got some experience up there, who are going to kind of help show me the ropes and give me things to think about and introduce me to people because like if I'm trying to work in a member's office, typically, as I understand it, and I haven't done this, but I know that you either worked on the campaign typically that got them to office, or maybe you are a family member of a wealthy donor. But that initial break-in to work in a member's office can be kind of a challenge, especially if you're coming from the military and you haven't had any past political experience. So could you talk to me about that a little bit?
Yeah, and 100% you're correct. And then also just kind of how and where you come in as well.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the standard, the standard pathway to a paid position on Capitol Hill is, you generally went to a, impressive school, you got good grades, you've been to Europe and you tried to save whales at least once.
Yep.
And that part's a joke, but if you're on the resume collecting side of things, I mean,
right.
it looks pretty homogenous. I've now led two committees up there, so
yeah,
I feel safe
Ivy
in
League
saying
school, Fulbright scholar, blah blah blah. Right? Yeah.
Well, and then parents that can float, their young child, with a place to live and food, and things have gotten a little better. Some laws have passed to, give interns, some more funding, to, pay their staff at a better level. So, I think those are positive changes, but
sure.
Nonetheless, there's a very, I think one of the things that, veterans have struggled with in trying to make a transition to the Hill is understanding that Capitol Hill is a weird place and that they really don't value, to the extent that they maybe should, experience that is not specifically Capitol Hill experience.
Right.
And so, it has a very linear hiring process, which is, first you do a non-paid internship and then you're a staff assistant, making, when I got my staff assistant gig, it was a solid $28,000 a year, which was
peanuts.
It's pretty off. Yeah, especially in DC, with the kid. And so, and then you're a legislative correspondent, and then you're a legislative assistant, then you're an LD, then you're a chief of staff.
Right.
That is kind of the common pathway. And so what we've tried to do over the years is not only break into opportunities the best we could find and help with, but also educate Capitol Hill in terms of, what is the value of hiring veterans, especially on your, VA, DOD, foreign affairs type issue areas. Right. Although we have vets that come up who want to work in agriculture, which is fine too. But really, I think educate members of Congress, especially, as to the value that veterans bring to the table. And we've tried to cut out some of the layers in terms of, instead of coming in as an intern, they're coming in as fellow. And as a fellow, they're working on policy issues, generally generally immediately, under the supervision of, somebody who knows what they're doing.
Right.
And then, ideally we try to get most of our veterans, if they decide they want to stay on the Hill, and they all don't, and that's okay. Some decide they'd rather work in the federal government or, for a nonprofit, veteran advocacy, whatever. But if they do stay on the Hill, that, ideally we get them in at kind of that legislative assistant level, which, pretty much puts them into working on policy almost immediately.
Well, this has been a great conversation. I've definitely learned a lot more about like how the Hill operates and how veterans can get involved. So like if I'm out here listening and I've got an inclination to go work on Capitol Hill or in the federal government in DC in some capacity, how can I get more information on Hill Vets? Like, where do I go and who do I talk to?
Yeah, thanks, Joe. Well, definitely check out hillvets.org. Our website has, information on both Hill Vets House, which is our fellowship program, as well as Hill Vets Lead, which is our leadership program that we discussed. We also have, our email sign up there. Yeah. We do a ton of events every year, Joe. That's how you learn about Hill Vets. And I'd say beyond that, there are other programs out there focused on, if folks are looking to, get involved in congressional campaigns, there are programs. If you're looking to break into the federal government, there are a lot of different routes you can take to continued service. What I like about HillVets is that, I do think congressional experience is pretty, second to none in terms of if you want to work in the policy or federal space.
Yeah.
And ideally, you can always come back to it, but me being honest, it's a harder route to come back to because, it doesn't tend to pay as much as, the private sector, even the federal government usually.
Yeah.
And so, especially if you're on kind of the start of this, pathway, if you're, transitioning out of service or you're finishing up school or, those, or even retiring, we have a lot of DoD retirees that come into the program, and they do great. And so, and that's not to, pigeonhole anybody that's thinking about it anyways. It's just, it tends to work well at those times for people.
Awesome. No, I mean, I know anytime it's just human psychology. In order for me to join a new group, I got to see a little bit of myself there. And I think that's exactly what y'all provide, right? You are an outpost on Capitol Hill and a resource for veterans who want to get involved and do the business of Congress. And, none of this democracy thing happens without good people working on Capitol Hill, especially veterans. So, Justin, thank you so much for speaking with us today. If you're interested in more, go to hillvets.org and look up Justin and his team. And if you're interested, they'll point you in the right direction.
Thank you so much for listening. If you found this podcast episode interesting or useful, please share it with the people you know. This episode was co-hosted by Joe Plensler and Ellen Gustafson. The audio and video were edited by King's Collab Studios. This podcast is a production of We the Veterans and Military Families, a 501c3 not-for-profit, nonpartisan veteran and military spouse-led organization focused on promoting positive and patriotic civic engagement to strengthen American freedom and liberty. Find out more about us at wetheveterans.us and follow us on social media.
Next week on Vetted Conversations, Ellen and I speak to Dr. Michael Hanlon of the Brookings Institution about why it's important to have civilian control of the military. We also have an in-depth conversation with the Honorable Joel Spanberger, a Navy veteran who leads the Selective Service, about why young Americans continue to have to register for a potential draft and whether women should have to do the same. And lastly, we talked to Mary Beth Brueggemann, a Marine Corps veteran who runs The Mission Continues, about how veterans can get involved in their communities after military service. So stay tuned for more great conversation.